Hello again, everyone. Today I'm going to continue with my Canadian series and feature the letter D, some various artists or various albums under the letter D. And the first album to show you is an album that might be considered one of those albums that you should be embarrassed to have in your record collection, but I do have a copy of this. It's a Canadian album. It's the DeFranco family featuring Tony DeFranco. Heartbeat, It's a Love Beat was the big hit single. And this also contains their second hit, Abracadabra. And 1973, 20th Century Records, although in Canada it was distributed by GRT. And the DeFranco family were from Port Colborne, Ontario, which is on the north side of Lake Erie, over towards Buffalo, New York. And somehow they were discovered in Los Angeles and became the darlings of Tiger Beat magazine and maybe 16 magazine, some of those others that were aimed at female teenagers, young teenagers. I didn't read any of those back in 1973. I was listening to Pink Floyd and things like that at that time. This is a cute album, though. There's actually a punch-out picture of Tony DeFranco on the back. I don't know why the girl who had this didn't punch his face out and hang it on her wall. Then there's all this fan club information inside. For $2.25, you could join the DeFranco family fan club by sending the money in a letter to Hollywood, California. You could also buy a book for $1.25 called The Secret of Tony DeFranco, which was his biography. They only had one or two big years, very short-lived. Canada's version of the Osmonds. Dillinger. Dillinger was a band, I think, from Toronto. And I recall there being two LPs. This is the first of the two. And it's from 1974. It was released on Daffodil Records, another great Canadian record company, who Klaatu were signed to Daffodil. Four-piece band. Side 2 of this is called Live and Return, which is an entire suite, the whole side. The third song on the first side is their cover of Randy California's Nature's Way, which was a song off Spirit's 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus. Dixon House. Dixon House was a keyboard player, I think, from Vancouver. This is called Masked Madness. This is the second Dixon House album that I know of. I know there was a previous album on Infinity Records, distributed by MCA here in Canada, from around 1979. The only other band I recall being on Infinity Records was New England, who had a couple albums. I know I have the first album. It's quite good for kind of a classic rock album. But this Dixon House album was on Flicker Records. This was actually recorded in Seattle, but Flicker is Mike Flicker, who produced Heart amongst many other groups. And there is another Heart connection to this album. Howard Leese, who was Heart's longtime guitar player, played guitar in this album. This is a staple of Canadian rock radio. Doucet. Jerry Doucet. Mama Let 'Em Play. Now, Jerry Doucet had been kicking around the Canadian music scene for a few years. I know back east in Toronto he was in several bands that I'm aware of. Abernathy Shagmaster was one of them. Then he came out west to Vancouver and recorded this first solo album for Mushroom Records in 1977. He has a beautiful Gibson double neck guitar on here, kind of similar to the one that Jimmy Page used to play sometimes. And big hit. This was a platinum album here in Canada. They still play Mama Let 'Em Play on the radio all the time, so often that you get sick of it, really. But it is a great song. I used to have a guitar. Back in the 90s, I had a guitar. It was a Les Paul Japanese knockoff, and it was autographed by Jerry Doucet. It came that way when I bought it. And since then I've sold it, though. Maybe I shouldn't have. This is Doucet's second album, called The Deuce Is Loose. And in the pictures here, he's standing in front of a wall of Marshall amps. I recall one hit off this one called Nobody. This was a gold album here in Canada. He had some other albums in the 80s, but they sold progressively less and less, and he's still kicking around the music scene. Drastic Measures. Drastic Measures were a new wave band from Toronto, and they were signed to Airwave Records, although distributed by Columbia here in Canada. And The big hit, I mean, if there was a hit, was their cover of the Teddy Bears Picnic. It wasn't really a big hit, but it was fairly well known, around Toronto at least. And this album kind of flips over like this, so it looks like it's got a double front side in a way. What's notable about this album too is here, guest artist Nash the Slash. Now Nash the Slash is well known around the Toronto music scene. I have several of his albums that I'll show later in the End series. Dr. Music, retrospective. This is a greatest hits album, per se, of the group Dr. Music. Now, I think Dr. Music was the nickname of Canadian producer, arranger, writer Doug Riley, the late Doug Riley. And Doug Riley is very famous in Canadian music circles, late 60s, early 70s. He worked with Ray Charles, I recall, in the late 60s, and then back in Canada, he formed this group called Dr. Music around 1971. Sun Goes By was a hit, and it was actually written by the same fellow that was in Mother Lode, that did that song When I Die, I think around 1969. And members of the group, there were a lot of vocalists. There were 7 or 8 singers in this group all at once, and they had very much of almost a gospel-y sound, kind of like Godspell or something. And it was, the music itself was kind of jazz influenced too, horn section, that type of thing. And of the singers, there were 2 here that became more notable later on. And Brian and Brenda Russell, who recorded as a duo later on. Brenda Russell also recorded as a solo act, probably more in the dance kind of thing, in the late 70s and early 80s. Brian Russell is actually Mr. Cheryl Ladd. He married Cheryl Ladd later on. So after they got rid of the singers after the first album, Dr. Music just became a smaller band, mostly the musicians. I think they did have some vocals though. This is their second album from 1973. Very plain cover. It was recorded for GRT Records. I just wanted to show you the GRT label. This is the early 70s GRT label, which was familiar to people here from bands like Lighthouse. The Flower Travelin' Band, Japanese band, they recorded for GRT in Canada. They actually recorded that album. It's quite obscure and valuable. They recorded that here in Canada, I think. The MAPL logo. It's like a little circle on records in the 1970s and later here in Canada to show that the record contains Canadian content. In 1971 in Canada, the government legislated 1/3 of all records on Canadian radio have to be Canadian records. So the record companies began putting the MAPL logo on all Canadian records to indicate that they were Canadian and they were good for the radio stations to play to prop up their Canadian content. Thanks for watching, everyone.